Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming here. We thought rather than having you not socially distanced in our corridor, the safest thing to do while we're still in level 2 lockdown is to be able to have you here for what is normally our caucus run. I'm joined today by Dr. Shane Retty and by Paul Goldsmith. Dr. Shane wrote to the Health Select Committee Chair, Louisa Wall, last night, and has asked for the second time that the Health Select Committee be reconvened and to call in front of it Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, senior officials, the Ministry of Health and the Minister of Health, so that actually we can get some clarity about what has happened in relation to the Covid-19 response, and particularly what has been characterised by the government ministers as being some sort of disconnection between both the Ministry of Health and the Minister of Health. Dr. Shane has not yet received any reply to that request. Of course, the first request he put forward was turned down on the basis that the Labour MPs would not agree to it. In addition to that, we have discussed the issue of the wage subsidy for the 4 days of extra lockdown in Auckland. We're noting in particular just how hard it is for businesses, and particularly in the hospitality sector. We've discussed it and have decided that it would be a much better move for the government to extend the wage subsidy for those 4 days, given that the wage subsidy is only being paid because of, in this time round, of the fact that COVID-19 has been allowed back into or come back into New Zealand. It's certainly at no fault of the hospitality sector or businesses in general or their staff, and it is a particularly difficult time, particularly during the weekend, which is normally the busiest time in the hospitality sector, but also for retail. So we've decided that is the kindest thing and the most sensible and pragmatic thing for the government to do, and we are saying that, in our opinion, that should have been extended for another 4 days, and we would support the government if they decide to change their minds. We're here to answer any questions. I've got both Shane and Paul with me, and happy to take any questions.
The wage subsidy, what do you see as the Finance Minister has tasked Treasury with looking at this now, what do you see as the sustainable kind of stopgap measure between the wage subsidy and whatever comes next?
Well, I think it's really clear is that the wage subsidy is not sustainable in its current form, which is why the border and is so important. It's absolutely crucial that we cannot have these constant incursions through the border, and that's one of the reasons that we believe that the border is actually key to the country economically, and also I think for people to have any certainty when they're running their businesses or they're going to work, whether or not they have a job, now seems to be dependent on whether or not the government can actually keep that border safe. And that's where the testing is so important, and that's also where the measures that we have discussed already are very important. So we also think it's really important for the public to be brought along with this, where people are being asked now to use masks on public transport, which we fully support. Would have thought that should have been done ages ago. It's a no-brainer in our opinion. But it's important that the public understand what's happened so that they can understand what they can do to help make things better for everyone. But ultimately, the wage subsidy in a long-term strategy, it's not going to be a goer.
Policy that's going to operate some kind of business support beyond the wage subsidy and beyond what we kind of already know?
Well, we have several policies we put out already around Business Start and also around Job Start, but in particular the main thing the businesses are wanting from us is to be able to have the border safe so that they can actually have some confidence in their own businesses. People understand what a difficult time it is in every country, and we're a very small economy, and it's even more important that when the government takes on a role of keeping the border safe, that it does its job.
Should masks used to be mandated more widely, say in bars and restaurants?
Well, I think it's it's difficult to eat your food with a mask on, obviously, but Dr. Shane might want to answer that one.
I think we'll be taking the advice from public health officials and following it closely, and at this point we're totally supportive of that advice. If it should change, then we would look at it then.
So you support the advice just to keep it public transport?
Yes, we are.
So when we asked the Prime Minister that yesterday, she said, look, I think that the world has been catching up on the use of face masks. Do you buy that argument? Do you think that the fact of using masks has evolved over the last few months?
Yes, I do, because if we recall 3 months ago, it wasn't a policy here in New Zealand, nor was it with the WHO, which is where we tended to get our advice from. So as we've learnt more and as that advice has changed, so our policies have changed, and we're supportive of the public advice.
So I mean globally, do you think that the research and the advice of the WHO has evolved over time?
Oh yes, definitely. I think they've become much more amenable to masks, which is their current advice. That is a change for them.
And what do you think about the use of masks in a school setting? Should they be mandatory at schools?
That's a complex situation because there are all sorts of issues with school children wearing masks. There's that concern that there might be that inequity, those who can afford masks and those who can't. So there's a number of complex challenges in education for children wearing masks. Again, we'll be taking advice from public health officials and from education who are weighing all these up. This is not a new topic to us. We visited this about 3 or 4 months ago, tried to find a way forward, but now we're being led by the current outbreak.
As you say, though, we've seen the World Health Organization sort of warm to the idea of masks. Do you think that we're likely to see them start to say masks should be worn in schools and that schools in New Zealand should prepare for that?
Well, I can't anticipate what the World Health Organization will say, but I think it is a trend towards more people wearing more masks in more situations.
Can you see a case of mask at level 1? These people who caught the disease on the bus, that was on level 1 when that happened. So could you see a case of a mask use on public transport being extended all the way down to level 1?
We'd have to see the data for that, but remember we're also saying that bus drivers and others who are doing movements of people between isolation facilities, we're very enthusiastic for them to be wearing masks and using PPE as well. So it's not a great step from the bus driver wearing a mask to the people on the bus wearing a mask.
People want to be strengthened a bit? Was it a bit too lax at that point?
Yes, I believe it was. It's part of what our concerns are at the border, that we think that transport operators between isolation facilities and the border should be using PPE.
The WHO has now recommended that older 12s wear a mask like an adult would. So do you think that in light of that advice from the WHO that they should be mandatory in schools?
I would imagine officials are taking that advice on board. Of course, that's because we understand that children over the age of 12 may be spreaders in their own right from that age, and that's why the information has changed, and I'm sure officials are taking that advice on board.
What's your party's position on cash grants for businesses?
Look, I think the critical thing to observe is if the economy is shut down in a lockdown, then there is a good argument for public support. And that's why we support the extension of the wage subsidy in another 4 days. It makes sense to continue with that.
Wouldn't be prepared to go as far as a cash grant to help out with rents and those other calls that businesses are making?
No, we're not at that stage yet, but we are very much in the camp that you do need to continue to support businesses, and the wage subsidy seems to be the best way to do that in the first instance. And if we continue to have lockdowns, then that continues to be a major issue.
So do you think that whenever there is a lockdown, there should be a wage subsidy or some kind of financial support that should?
Well, look. I mean, as the Prime Minister said right at the start, the worst thing we can do as a country is yo-yo back into lockdowns. And so the critical thing for the economy is to make sure that the border is working effectively. And if you are telling businesses that they cannot trade, then there will need to be some sort of support going on. Whether it's a wage subsidy, I don't know. There are other options, but you cannot do nothing if you are telling businesses in the public health, in the interests of the public health and for the rest of New Zealand, you cannot trade, then there does need to be some sort of support.
And don't forget that we want to have a public health summit as well. Should we be fortunate enough to lead the next government to make sure that we actually thrash out these ideas, we think it's really important that we don't just impose what we think is an idea on businesses, small and large and medium, and their workers. We have to actually bring people with us, and I think that's crucially important.
You keep saying that there perhaps doesn't need to be a solution if you're in charge because you will keep it out of the courts.
Yeah.
Who in particular is going to be held accountable if you let COVID come through the border?
Well, we will not be letting COVID come through out into the community in that way. I think it's very important to understand that if we have the border secure and we have it very safe, that we're there, and we have in place the tracking mechanisms around the COVID app, and we also have something like a COVID card, some sort of Bluetooth technology as well, and we have the testing, that any incursion through there will be much more quickly found.
Is that you?
Sorry?
Is it you that's accountable?
Well, the Prime Minister always has to be responsible ultimately, and we all know that. The current Prime Minister has said we are, whoever we are. I think that's pretty obvious that the public at the moment are currently paying the price because the government has not been able to secure that border and to undertake the testing that they promised to do. We've heard all sorts of theories about how this COVID-19 came into the country, including cool stores, frozen peas and all sorts of other ideas. So far, the only indication that we had is it came through the border, through humans, and it came through, and there was not the testing that we were promised as a country that we were.
Is there a promise that you can make that as a government you will not allow COVID into the New Zealand community?
Well, I think we can say that we will not allow it to be in a country, a New Zealand community, and not be able to be very quickly contained, very quickly contained. Well, no, we're not going to sit back and allow it in some form of policy such as some countries have, which has been to allow it into the community. Certainly, it is not something that we are going to sit about saying, well, we can't do anything about it. We can do a lot about it.
If you're differentiating your approach with the government, are you saying they're sitting back allowing it into the community,
well,
or are you comparing other countries?
I'm saying this. The government promised that there was testing at the border of border staff, and there wasn't. They told us that border staff were not necessarily willing to be tested. Actually, we know border staff weren't asked, and in some cases asked to be tested, and were refused to test. The government has not undertaken what anybody would expect would be being undertaken. In other words, what they promised. We would not do that. That's why it's important when we look at COVID-19 and any incursion, from a health and safety point of view and risk management, you have to have more than one layer in terms of catching it. We're saying that any mistakes, it's fronted up, and we're not going to sit there pointing fingers at each other and saying, oh, it was your fault, my fault, somebody's fault. The fact is that that is part of ministerial responsibility. At the moment, the Prime Minister has put in place a Minister of Health, Chris Hipkins. He's essentially part-time in that role because he's got such big other jobs to deal with. He hasn't, for instance, briefed Dr. Shane in the last week. It's over a week now since he's had any briefing on the health issues at the moment. He hasn't been keeping us up to date. It is really important that when we look at these issues... Well, there's a reason that Heather Simpson and Brian Roach has been brought in, isn't it? It's not because everything was going well. Clearly they have dropped the ball.
Judith Collins, do you think that the South Island should be able to move to level 1, which perhaps has some travel restrictions heading down south?
Well, it's very difficult, isn't it? And we don't have the information that the Prime Minister has. I've made it very clear that without that information and without all the criteria that she's taken into account, which we do not have access to, it would be wrong for us to be second-guessing that information if we don't have the information. So I have also suggested that the Prime Minister might want to make that information available to the public, as well as obviously to us as the opposition, because it is important that people are brought along with those decisions. I understand that people in Gore might be wondering why it is that they're in a level 2 lockdown when they've got not much connection through to the Auckland region, or even that part of the Auckland region that's been actually affected. But that's for the government to explain it. They have the information and we don't.
Based on what you do know, do you think that the South Island could somehow kind of be sectioned off and able to move back to level 1? You must have been hearing from people down there as well, like we've been wanting to keep businesses back up and running, again, wanting to be able to go about life.
Look, we're hearing from a lot of people who don't understand the government's decision from yesterday, but we're saying, and we're taking the advice that we know of, which is mostly it's from the information we're receiving from people.
Based on what you do know, should the South Island be able to shift down to level 1?
I've made it very plain that without better advice, the advice that the Prime Minister has, we have to actually accept that advice or the decision she's made, because we do not have the advice that she's made that on. I'm not going to second guess it.
Why are you backing only a week from 4-day long extensions to wage subsidy when effectively these businesses are losing a week in, which is essentially a whole week's revenue? Why just 4 days?
Do you want to talk to that one?
I mean, it's just obviously if it continues to slide, then you'd have to go further. But what we've seen is an extension in level 3 of 2 weeks, and now it's an extra 4 days. Just as a first step, you would say, well, we should extend that emergency wage subsidy for an extra 4 days. I mean, you can argue about whether it should be 5 or 3, but I think that's just a logical way. Yeah, it's pro-rata. It's just it's longer than we anticipated. And look, if it has to go further, then we'll have to extend further.
How do you square the more hawkish position on debt as part of?
Well, look, purely and simply, if the government just says to businesses that they cannot trade, they cannot do their job that they're set up to do because of public health reasons, then there is a good argument for some continued government support. And the point that we make is this is the very worst thing for the country, to be going back into lockdown and to be paying all this wage subsidy. This is not what we want as a country. We want to be getting out of this and concentrating and rebuilding and regrowing the economy. But it is what it is, and that's why it's so important to avoid these lockdowns.
We've got time for one more question before we go to caucus.
The Business Committee yesterday or last night decided to have this week and next week. Is that something you supported, or do you?
Oh, absolutely no. We believe that it is important while we are in a lockdown, for instance, that we should be here in Parliament asking the questions that we are able to ask, holding the government to account in the best way that we can. But we also believe that next week we have no problem being here. We think it's only 2 days of Parliament. Look, if we had more information from the government about how they made their decisions, maybe that wouldn't be so necessary. But we don't have that information. Our way of getting the information is to ask questions. Thank you very much. What's that?
What are places missing on the alert level changes? The Prime Minister's laid out its transmission rates, the amount of people getting affected, the mystery cases.
Well, we don't have the information.
Integrates and why, say, the South Island is not at level 1 because there's a boring like we'll leave it or we'll put it back.
We don't. We don't have the information that the Prime Minister has. She's given you some headlines. She's given you some, in the public, some headlines that she's looked at, but we actually haven't seen the information ourselves. I think it's also important to understand that the public needs to be brought along with these. What we're seeing at the moment, particularly in Auckland and the rest of the country as well, is a view that actually the public is now very much paying for errors at the border. And what we haven't seen is quite what happened, which is why we fully support Dr. Shane in his request to the Health Select Committee that that committee convene. It can easily convene by Zoom or any other way and ask those questions. I think it's important if the government is blaming officials or trying to say there's some disconnection between the government instructions and the officials and what was done, that the officials have their chance to say. Thank you.